I should like, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen and of the entire British people, to express our thanks, admiration, affection, and good wishes. We shall not forget you, and we shall watch with the closest interest as you embark on this new era of your remarkable history.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode number 8 of Dragon's Gate. In this episode, it's finally time to make this into a city. So far, we've just been working on and around this huge Central Park area, but there hasn't been much context for it. There's not really anything surrounding it. As you already know, the city is loosely based on Shenzhen, among others, which has the most amount of skyscrapers in China, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very extremely vertical city. However, as a foil to that, it is also one of the greenest cities in China, with something like 45% green coverage in built-up areas. So this gives me a fairly simple formula for the city: skyscrapers and trees and lots of both. Now, you might wonder what the effects of having so many trees will be on my performance, and so far it's been pretty much negligible. The real issues come from the thousands and thousands of procedural objects that I've used so far. I've done some testing where I get rid of all of the trees and there wasn't much of a performance difference. But as you can see, performance is not good at all in this area. This leads me to have to dial back the detail a little bit if this is going to be a large city. And so going forward, there will be specific areas that are more highly detailed, but the bulk of the city as such will be a lot less detailed. And having it being such a green city will lead me to be doing a lot of tree detail with mostly low try count trees. For example, along the roads that have trees, those trees are only around 500 tries. And I don't think I'll be using any trees with more than 1,000 tries anywhere unless there is something very specific that needs to be a special kind of tree. Except palm trees, those have a lot of tries and I use them quite a bit. As far as what I build in this episode, it's essentially just the main skyline of the central business district, and it pretty much follows a simple formula. Rows of skyscrapers along the side edges of the central park, and they're usually 2 skyscrapers deep in a lot of the places. This creates a really interesting, what I would call, valley effect. The main difference between this city and real-life Shenzhen is that here, the Central Park is in an hourglass shape rather than a long rectangular area, so it kind of lessens the valley effect a bit because from certain vantage points, buildings are hidden behind other buildings. And I suppose that's my own mistake because I initially planned it to be this hourglass shape, but in the end, it still looks decent, and the vibe I'm looking to create for this city is starting to show up slowly. I start off in this top left corner. I didn't know specifically what I wanted in the other places, but for this specific block, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted. I also used it as an opportunity to experiment a bit with the building style, and I also needed to kind of ease myself into a larger scale and less detailed technique of building. After placing down the first building, I needed to put in some roads because the majority of these buildings will not have any road access directly to the main artery roads. That's because they're set back several in-game units, and usually they're also going to have some sort of pedestrian path or something blocking their access anyways. And then it's just a matter of setting in the buildings and getting in a little bit of detail. I skip over several minutes here of me just experimenting with different things, different podiums and bases of the building, and that sort of thing. But I did know at the base of some of these buildings there needed to be some sort of a podium, and that's something I will end up doing fairly often throughout this episode. And something else I'll do several times this episode is make parking lots. There seem to be a fair amount of surface parking lots in these areas in real life, so I'm sure to add plenty of those as well, but it's not extensive and insane like it is in America, but they do exist. And I'll also create a lot of tunnel entrances that would lead down into underground parking as well. And aside from that, I also add a fairly extensive network of pedestrian paths around all of the buildings. At this point, I decided to upgrade to CSUR roads with trees because those trees add a lot of detail that I would end up doing anyways, and they don't count towards the tree limit. Not that the tree limit matters because I'm using the Illuminated Trees mod for obvious reasons. But the base tree the CSUR roads use are quite small, and I wanted to use something a bit taller. So I used these leafy tin trees by Fidelmo, and I upgrade literally all of the roads I have laid down to have that tree. But getting back to the block I was working on, I start with tree detail. And the name of the game here is rows of trees around the perimeters of networks or in front of buildings or in empty areas. I'm using a variety of different trees. I have two types of palm trees. I have the Canary Island date palm and I have the Chinese fan palm. And then I have a couple of packs of low tri trees and bushes from 2 or 3 different creators on the workshop. But after most of the trees were down, that left 2 empty spaces in this block. The first one I had simply filled with a small building, and the second one I added a road that led down into a tunnel as if it was going to an underground parking lot, and I put a couple of barrier gates to finish it off. The next block I moved down to is on the opposite end of the PO mall that I created last episode. I start off by bisecting it with this 4-lane road without a median, and then I just start placing buildings. I wanted there to be about 8 buildings on this block, 4 shorter ones on the half block closest to the park, and 4 taller buildings directly behind those. The first 2 buildings I placed, I just used 2 of these office towers, and at the base of them I put some of these glass office blocks. The second building is a little bit more complicated because it's entirely procedural objects. I used PO to mirror this curved building to give it this rounded shape, and at the base of it I used this roundabout building that I actually thought I would never find a use for. Then I surround both buildings with pedestrian roads and paths. I'll be using a lot of pedestrian roads throughout the rest of this episode. Vehicles rarely drive on them, but it gives these buildings easier road access so they can set back properly from the main roads. Inside of the PO building, I add a few office block service queues to give it functionality, and at the front corner of this block, I decided to give it a little extra detail with the trees with some bushes and flowers that I don't use very often. And then I go around the block and just put down lots of trees as usual. Eventually, I get to this concrete area between the pedestrian road and one of the buildings, and I decided to turn it into a restaurant or a cafe of some sort. On the left side of it, I put some nicer lounging chairs and tables, but for most of it, I put in some regular tables with just some umbrellas. I also added some awnings and a couple of these futuristic pod things under the main building, and I added a Chinese flag and some grassy curbs and finished it off with some nice brick decals. For the second half of this block, I again start with placing the 4 taller buildings and surround them with these new road networks that look like vanilla pedestrian paths. Then I add podiums to 2 of these buildings using different office blocks, and I'll skip over most of the trees because I think you get the point by now. But next to one of the buildings, I decide to add a small fenced-in service area with some trucks and a couple of other props here and there. And on the front of that building, I use these square planters and put in some palm trees. And then on the other side of the building, I also add a fenced-in parking lot. For the next building, I repeat by making another parking lot and more of those palm tree planters. And the last building on this block, I add another service area with some trash bins and a random truck and a police kiosk. I also did an extra block on this side of the park. Originally for this episode I was only going to be doing this side of the park, the west side, but I ended up doing both because this episode would have been fairly short otherwise. Again, I start with bisecting with a 4-lane road and start adding buildings. This block specifically is loosely based off of some random block in Guangzhou near their central business district. I add these 4 tall skinny buildings with a podium at the bottom just to kind of fill that area between the little road and the main road. And behind it, I start adding in some residential high-rises. Along the big main road, I add another high-rise office building with more of those office blocks as a podium. And then I add an underground parking access and start with the tree detailing. On other parts of the block, I add another surface parking lot, and in front of the skinny buildings, I add some tile decals to kind of round it all out. For the other side of the park, I had a slightly different approach. Instead of going block by block, I decided to put down all of the main buildings first. This, again, took some experimentation, but for the most part, I did that off camera. But after I got a good idea of the sets of buildings I wanted to use, that's when I started to record. Also, a difference for this side is that I had to do 3 blocks instead of just 2 on the other side. The middle block on the other side is taken up by that PO mall that I made last episode, which if you haven't seen, you should really go check that out, because that's pretty much my best work yet. And I got a ton of great feedback from that episode, by the way, and it's really given me motivation to do even more crazy stuff with this series later on. Anyways, the first block I'll work on is the northernmost block that has the train line and the elevated metro lines going over it. Again, it's bisected with a road, but this time the road takes a turn and curves into the parallel road, or the road that's parallel to it, because I didn't want it to dead end, and I couldn't make it have an intersection with the road that goes under the expressway for obvious reasons. Then I add in some smaller 2-way roads and some more of those pedestrian path roads so I could have the buildings properly set back. After the roadways, I put in a line of bushes just in front of the buildings, and then I move behind them and work a little bit in the area between the road that's bisecting and the pedestrian roads. In the first little open area there, I make a parking lot or 2, and then in the others I just add trees. And next to the first building, which I guess is technically the middle building in this area, I had another loading dock area with some trucks on the side. I actually clipped a random warehouse building I have into the skyscraper as a way to get some sort of side doors that can be used as loading docks without having to use props. And at the front of the building, I add some tile decals and a brick pedestrian path on the side with some bushes. Then I move underneath the elevated metro tracks and add a somewhat larger surface parking lot with a fence and a gate and such. And there was also this open space where the bisecting road curved into the main road, where I added another tunnel for underground parking and a random growable office building. And adjacent to the main road, there was also a space where I put 2 small commercial towers with a podium at the bottom, and I also add a couple of newer looking residential buildings. And between those residential buildings, I add some brick pedestrian paths and some palm trees. Then I moved to the space under the railroad tracks. This space isn't super usable, so I just have some pedestrian paths and some bushes going through. At the front of one of the larger buildings, I add some trees and decals and a few prop doors because apparently this building doesn't have any doors. And in the back of the building, I added some more decals and some of those palm tree planters that I keep using. In the space between one of the main roads and the railroad tracks, I also add a few smaller mid-rise buildings to just kind of fill the space. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have all the smaller areas like this only have paths and trees or just be empty of usable buildings. Before I get started with the next 2 blocks, I take a moment and expand the underground metro. I'm adding a couple of stations so I don't have to go back and do it again later because I do have a tendency to forget about public transport since I'm an American. But I will say that these two stations get quite busy after I run the simulation for a while. But moving on to the middle block, obviously I started with the pedestrian roads like I have been doing for the past couple of blocks, but I also add a series of pedestrian paths around the metro station and another small 4-lane road because there was quite a bit of space behind the main buildings. Then, at the base of a couple of buildings, I add some more office blocks to act as a podium. One of them was really weird and annoying because the back of the main building was asymmetrical and it was bothering me. Otherwise, in the large empty space between all the main buildings, I add some more residential towers with office buildings at the bottom, and I also add 2 tunnels for underground parking. And then I make use of the same tree detailing and adding of parking lots and all of that other stuff that I've been doing this entire build. I'm not going to go back over it because you've already seen it, but anyways, we'll move on to the next block. For the last block, after I get in all of the roads, I make a mirror copy of the residential development from the last block, except for with only 1 underground parking access this time. Then I go around with a bunch of pedestrian paths, making sure there is easy access from the main sidewalks to the pedestrian roads and over to the metro stations. Next to one of the buildings, I make a plaza with planters with palm trees in like a grid pattern, and I put some pedestrian paths through it. And at one of the buildings closest to the central park, I do a lot of decal work with some red brick decals on the outside of the block and some white brick decals on the interior. And then I do a similar grid thing with the palm trees. At another one of the buildings, I make a large surface parking lot that goes around 2 sides of the building. And then at the front of that building, I add a little cafe area surrounded by some glass gate props that I'm actually glad I found a use for. Then in front there's some trees and some tile decals at the entrance. But other than the standard detailing I've been doing everywhere else, that pretty much wraps up this build. I know I skipped a ton of the detailing, but it was just so repetitive that it really wasn't worth looking at in depth. After you see me do it a few times, it's pretty much just the same thing on the rest of the other blocks, except the layout is a little bit different. With this expansion complete, the city has really come alive, both in population numbers and in the vibe that I'm trying to give this city. Like I said before, I know it's not another one of the detailed builds that I've been doing before, but it needs to be like this for both performance reasons and to give context to the areas that are already detailed or that will be detailed in the future. Next episode, I think, will be the start of another crazy project that might take more than 1 episode to complete. It will definitely be a huge challenge to get right because it's a lot more complex in the sense of needing to plan around things, unlike previous builds where they have their own fully dedicated plots of land. But we'll see when we get there. Before I sign off on this episode, I'll ask you once more to drop a comment because my favorite thing to do other than the builds themselves is interact with the audience. As Gary Vee says, your comments are my oxygen. I love them all, even the negative ones. I'll also ask you to drop a like and subscribe if you're new. Pretty much everyone is new to my channel, so I'd like to welcome all of you to our fledgling community. I'm glad you're here, and I hope to see you in episode 9 of Dragon's Gate.